Welcome, everyone, to episode 3 of the American Experiment podcast. I'm John Hinderaker, joined today by Isaac Orr. Isaac is a policy fellow at American Experiment, specializing in energy and the environment. Isaac, you and Mitch Rolling earlier this week filed a public comment in Washington, D.C., in the administrative process that is going on, where the EPA is proposing to add some regulations that would govern coal-fired and natural gas-fired power plants, right?
Yeah. And, it's nerd stuff, right? So this is really in the weeds in terms of the regulatory process, right? So essentially, the administration knows that it can't get the regulations that it wants passed through Congress, so they're using the administrative state and the Environmental Protection Agency to essentially enforce these rules on existing coal-fired power plants and also, yes, natural gas-fired power plants. So do you want me to elaborate?
Well, I think the starting point, Isaac, is what would these rules do? What is this new body of regulations?
So they would essentially require coal-fired power plants to either retrofit with carbon capture and sequestration equipment. Essentially, the idea is that it's like a giant catalytic converter that you can strap onto your coal plant, capture the CO2, and then pump it underground. The problem is there hasn't been a demonstration project that has worked very well. There's one power plant in Canada that the EPA uses as its basically uses to justify requiring this technology, but that power plant never quite lives up to its billing in terms of like how much CO2 it actually captures, how much it costs to do so. So there were a lot of people who questioned EPA's use of that one power plant as a justification for imposing this kind of like technological requirement on coal plants.
But I take it, Isaac, that under this new rule, the power plant would have to either meet a very low standard for CO2 emissions or else shut down.
Yes.
And if you ask the EPA, they'll say, oh, well, you can meet the standard by installing carbon capture technology. But the reality is that's more a hope and a wish at this point than it is a reality.
Yes. And, just to kind of elaborate on that. So, Minnesota is part of a regional grid, 15 states, called the Mid-Continent Independent Systems Operator. So it stretches from Minnesota down to Mississippi. But there are 4 other, they call them independent systems operators or regional transmission organizations. Like those two words or those two entities are kind of interchangeable when you're talking about electricity lingo. But essentially, the grid operators for like Pennsylvania, it's called PJM. So it basically covers the mid-Atlantic states. So Pennsylvania, New Jersey, parts of Virginia, West Virginia, they all filed comments together and said, hope is not a strategy for these technologies like carbon capture and sequestration, co-firing, so-called green hydrogen that's made by using electrolysis with water, but it can only be powered by wind and solar. So, and it was also the Southwest Power Pool, which is the regional grid to the west of us, and the ERCOT one. So that's Electric Reliability Council of Texas. So 4 of these, regional grid operators that represent 154 million people in the United States came together and said, look, there are a lot of problems with the proposal that EPA has, produced, the new regulations, and they actually encouraged EPA to withdraw the rules for now and kind of rework them, which is kind of unprecedented for these regional transmission organizations to come out and tell EPA.
They try to stay out of politics.
Yes, they do.
These are the grid operators, totally apolitical, but it's basically a flashing red warning light that the grid is in big trouble if these rules go through. Isaac, I don't think the EPA is so ill-informed that they don't understand that they are trying to impose a technology on coal-fired and also natural gas-powered power plants. Don't you think that what they really have in mind is that power plants are not going to be able to meet this standard, CO2 emission standard, and therefore they're going to shut down?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to speculate on EPA's motives, but that is definitely an argument that a lot of people are making, right? So there have been several different groups that have submitted similar things to EPA saying, hey, look, we don't think that this is going to work. So you're essentially, forcing these coal-fired power plants to retire, and then we're going to be relying on wind, solar, and luck, essentially, in order to keep the lights on.
Well, so that's what the EPA regulations are all about, what they purport to do. So I guess the next question is, how did American Experiment get involved in this process?
Yeah, so essentially, we were approached to look at the reliability of these regulations. So the state of North Dakota said, hey, you guys are really good at modeling the impacts of different rules, regulations, laws. Like, they saw the work that we did with the 100% carbon-free mandate in Minnesota, Wisconsin. I think we've done like 9 or 10 states at this point, done multiple projects for some states. So we have really kind of established ourselves as, leading thought leaders on this issue across the country. So they said, hey, would you model the impact of this in that MISO region, so that Midwest region?
Which is 15 states.
15 states, yeah. So we said yes, and what we did was we looked at EPA's own assumptions. So when EPA puts out a new regulation, they have to justify it from a scientific and economic standpoint. And, it's this really long document called a regulatory impact analysis. I think the one that they used for this one was like 350 pages or something like that, right? And then they also had a bunch of spreadsheets that showed what EPA thinks will be the least cost way to comply with these regulations in the future.
So they've got a theory about what the grid is going to look like under these regulations, and they've laid it out in that document, right?
Yep.
And just not a lot of detail, but in sort of a high-level view, what is the grid that's contemplated, at least per the EPA, under these regs?
Yeah, so EPA assumes that most or all of the coal plants in this MISO region will be shut down by 2040, and they'll be replaced with some new natural gas plants, but largely wind and solar facilities. So they are essentially anticipating that, the arguments that other people are making about this essentially closing down coal plants, EPA doesn't appear to be disputing that in their own modeling, right? Their own modeling would suggest that, yes, that is true. So what we did was we took the, essentially what happens is right now, MISO has about 204 gigawatts of capacity, and nobody really understands what a gigawatt is, right? And that's fair. So just think of it as like 204 Legos that you're going to stack together in order to make sure that you're able to, meet the peak demand on your system plus a margin of safety. So by 2055, EPA is expecting that to grow to like 457 gigawatts. So you're doing a 2.5 times increase of the installed capacity on the grid.
But that's not because they're expecting demand for electricity to rise by that much, is it?
Right. So they're expecting demand for electricity to grow some, but the main reason that you have this huge expansion in the amount of wind and solar on the grid is because wind and solar aren't as reliable as a coal or a natural gas or a nuclear plant. So I
guess this is blindingly obvious, Isaac, but solar only works if the sun is shining, and it doesn't shine at night. It doesn't shine when it's cloudy. And in a climate like ours here in Minnesota, if you have solar panels covered up with snow and ice, they're not going to generate electricity either, right? And likewise, wind turbines. You drive along on the highway, and a lot of the time you look at wind turbines and they're just sitting there doing nothing because the wind isn't blowing. So is the idea that the EPA contemplates really a massive overbuilding of capacity because it knows that most of the time solar panels and wind turbines don't produce anything?
Yep, that's exactly right.
So this is where American Experiment gets into the act. And so what exactly did you and Mitch Rolling do?
Yeah, so essentially what we did was we took the grid that EPA thinks is going to exist in future years, right? So they look at 7 hypothetical years, 2028, and then 2030, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, right? So, and they have an amount of installed capacity on their grid that they think will exist, or they model will exist during this time. So we said, okay, well, EPA thinks that this is what the grid is going to look like. So would this grid, this hypothetical grid that EPA has modeled, be able to meet hourly electricity demand for the MISO region based on historical years? So we looked at historic years of 2019, 2020, 21, and 22, and also wind and solar capacity factors. So, a capacity factor is just a fancy way of saying how productive was your wind turbine or solar panel during this hour on a scale of, as a percentage. So scale of 1 to 100. Like, was it 100% effective or productive? Was it 0% productive, right?
And I think you've told me, Isaac, in the past that MISO, in their calculations, assumes that wind turbines are over the space of a year. They could be zero at any given moment, but over the space of a year, MISO assumes that wind turbines are only going to produce 18.1% of their alleged capacity. Am I saying that right?
Yeah. So that's, it's actually even, that's a charitable way to say it. So MISO has moved to kind of this seasonal accreditation. So they say, well, wind turbines are, X% reliable during winter months, spring months, summer months, and winter months. And the 18.1 is actually the summer accreditation, which is the lowest amount out of all of those months. So MISO actually thinks that wind is more reliable in winter or fall or spring. And, there are arguments for and against that. So, and that's kind of a topic for another episode. But so EPA kind of adopts similar accreditation. So they think that they're, having enough capacity on the grid because they're basically too confident in the wind and the sun showing up. And what we found was, there are times, so EPA's accreditation for wind, existing wind turbines is 19%. We found that there's a lot of periods where wind is below that. So what ended up happening was massive blackouts. If you just take the grid that EPA has modeled for the future and you kind of hindcast that for wind and solar productivity and the hourly shifts in electricity demand, right? So at night, demand for electricity is very low because everybody's asleep and you don't have a bunch of office buildings on. But as people start to wake up, people go to work, factories start up, you see this increase. It looks like a bunch of camel humps, right? If you were to look at 7 days worth of electricity demand, it's just a 7-hump camel, essentially. Mm-hmm. And what we found is there isn't enough reliable capacity on EPA's grid of the future in order to make sure that you're meeting that demand during those hump periods because there's not enough natural gas capacity on the system.
So if you look at the public comment that you guys filed, which is like a 30-page report, basically, something like that, it's full of charts and graphs, right? It's all data, mathematical calculations, charts and graphs that show all these things. And if you look at the kind of chart that you're talking about there, a couple of things kind of jumped out at me when I looked at your comment. One is that even under the EPA's assumptions, which you adopted in terms of what the grid they think is going to look like, if you look at one of those charts that shows the high, the peaks of electricity demand during the day and then the valleys at night, and you say, well, where is the electricity actually coming from? The overwhelming majority of it is coming from natural gas, either combined cycle plants or what's the other one?
Combustion turbine.
Or combustion turbine plants. The overwhelming majority is natural gas. And then on the humps, during the peaks, you see the, small amounts of, here's some wind, here's some solar, here's some battery storage. But as your charts show, if we have the kinds of weather conditions that in fact we have had in MISO in 2019, 20, 21, 22, and you look at the grid as the EPA imagines it in the future, there's not enough. There are times when there's not enough electricity to keep the lights on.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And did your method allow you to actually quantify the blackouts that we can expect under these regulations?
Yes. So, some of them are very long. We're talking 15-hour blackouts. And it's interesting that most of the blackouts are happening in winter months, January, because you get very low solar participation in the grid during those periods, right? So I think MISO gives solar a 5% capacity accreditation in the winter.
That's absolutely pathetic.
It is.
You drive down the highway and you see these giant solar farms. Most of the time, they do absolutely nothing.
So yeah, you're essentially punting on 3 months, right? When you're looking at the solar accreditation that MISO has. So because so much of the installed capacity on EPA's model grid and how much it relies on solar in order to be able to meet your periods of high demand. And, if you have a wind drought during the winter, which we observe several times, and, one of the problems with relying on wind in the winter is if it gets below negative 22, they shut the wind turbines off because it gets too cold for them to operate. And there's actually a heating element powered by electricity in those wind turbines that kicks on. So, during periods of the highest electricity demand, when it's coldest, we actually have wind turbines as net consumers of power. They're drawing power from the rest of the grid and kind of cannibalizing on reliability rather than contributing to it. So, these are the real life struggles that we're going to have in across the country. Frankly, we only looked at the MISO region, but these are the challenges that come along with trying to enact regulations that will fundamentally transform the power grid. And one of the biggest shortcomings in EPA's analysis, in our opinion, was they never did any of this hourly reliability analysis. They just assumed that, okay, well, we think that this is going to be reliable, and based on as reliable as we think wind and solar will be, this should all work out. And it's like, well, no, you need to do your homework.
So the EPA has actually never done an analysis that contradicts what you guys came up with in your public comment. Is that right?
So American Experiment, to my knowledge, is the only organization that did this kind of hourly analysis of what EPA has proposed for their grid. So
does EPA just kind of take averages and say, well, on the average, the lights stay on? Is it really that poor quality?
So, so what they do is they look at, okay, do we have enough gigawatt hours of electricity? So, this is kind of getting, wonky and technical. So for the audience at home, I like to think of, megawatts and gigawatts, those are like the speedometer on your car. That's how much you can be producing at any given time, right? So think of that as the needle. And then megawatt hour is basically a measurement of how far have you gone over the span of an hour, right? So that's kind of like the odometer. And I know that this isn't a perfect analogy, but it does help a lot of people kind of contextualize. Okay, so a gigawatt hour is a measure of how much electricity you have consumed.
Theoretically available.
Consumed over a period of time. And then the odometer, which is the megawatt, is the that's the speed that you theoretically have available to you at any given time, right? So maybe I made this more confusing by trying to use an analogy, but at least I tried. EPA, they don't actually look to see if they have the energy that they need in order to meet that shifting demand over time. So that's really alarming because those other 4 RTOs that I was talking about earlier said, this is going to present major challenges for reliability. I don't think that they did the analysis themselves, but that's why we think that we added a lot of value to the conversation.
Yeah. And by the way, I can't remember if we said this or not, but you guys got hired by the state of North Dakota to do this, right?
Yes.
The state of North Dakota is very concerned, about being able to keep the lights on for its citizens, being able to afford electricity. We'll talk about cost in a minute. But so the work that you did was actually requested by the state of North Dakota and done on their behalf.
Yep, absolutely.
So I guess we've been talking about reliability, and this is something you guys have modeled. You got the only statistical model I think that anybody in the country has developed that really gets at these things in a detailed way. But there's also a cost element, right? And so a second part of your public comment. So first of all, you find, look, under adverse weather conditions, when the wind doesn't happen to be blowing and the sun doesn't happen to be shining, we get massive blackouts. And I think in your report, you say that the magnitude of the blackout could be equal to, for example, the entire state of Minnesota plus the entire state of Wisconsin.
Yes, yeah. It's a massive blackout, right? So essentially what happens is there's a 26 gigawatt blackout, which is about 19.5% of all the energy that was being consumed at that time. So essentially think of 1 in 5 houses in the MISO region going dark as a result of, not having enough wind, not having enough battery storage, not having enough solar. And, that's really not a credible basis for a rule, right? Like if the EPA's own grid says, oh yeah, don't worry, there's going to be these huge blackouts, we said no, like nobody's going to feel that that's a reasonable or rational way to construct the grid moving forward. That's kind of an arbitrary assumption, right?
So the second thing that you looked at, therefore, was, well, what would you have to spend if this rule shuts down the coal-fired plants and limits the extent to which people can use the natural gas plants? How much would you have to spend in additional, wind and solar?
Yep.
In order to not guarantee no blackouts, but at least get yourself into a safer position? Is that stating it right?
Yeah. So that's right. So what we did was we ran our modeling, our hourly modeling, and we said, okay, we're going to start at 2019, and we're going to make sure that there's continuous electricity service through 2022, right? So granted, that's only 4 years, and that's a small sample size too, but at least that's a start when it comes to this reliability modeling and building enough.
Well, it's kind of a minimum threshold, right?
You would think so.
This doesn't guarantee no blackouts, but what it does do is it says, well, at least under the weather conditions of the last 4 years, you wouldn't have blackouts.
Correct. So we added some natural gas, not a lot, mostly wind and solar and some more battery storage. I believe I'd have to look at the numbers again for the exact numbers, but adding all of this extra capacity, so it would be about a third more. Like EPA says, okay, well, we think about 450 gigawatts, so a 2.5 times increase compared to today's MISO grid would be necessary. You'd actually have to go about 600. So we're saying 32% more than EPA is modeling.
So what's the cost of that, Isaac?
Yeah.
I mean, this is just ruinous.
Yeah, it's $246 billion through 2055, which is $7.7 billion a year. And that annual number is important because EPA is assuming that the benefits, the net benefits of this regulation for the entire country will be $5.9 billion. So what we've determined is the additional compliance cost that EPA isn't really taking account of because they didn't do a reliability analysis. That additional compliance cost exceeds the expected net benefits just in this region alone.
And yeah, that's right. So that $246 billion, that's just for MISO, which is the 15 states, is vastly more for the United States. But one of the reasons why what you just said is so relevant, Isaac, is that under federal law, agencies are supposed to do a cost-benefit analysis of regulations. Is this regulation actually doing more good than harm? Now, obviously, that's not always easy to do, but what you're finding is that on this basis alone, the cost vastly exceeds the benefit.
Yes, yeah. And, that's really important because EPA goes out of its way to assure the public that this rule isn't going to impede the ability of utility companies to reliably serve their customers, right? So EPA is kind of acknowledging the importance of reliability in its own documentation. And then when we go through and we run this, it's, we're the only people that to my knowledge that have done it, but, anytime you do a model, your model should be able to hindcast based on previously observed conditions, right? Like you can't pretend to know what your grid is going to look like in the future if you haven't even tried to look at what it would do based on past or historical conditions.
Yeah, we don't know what the weather conditions are going to be in 2028, but we do know what they were in 2019.
Yes, and if your modeled grid can't handle what happened in 2019, then you need to go back to the drawing board and figure out, like, okay, well, how would we handle a situation if we had, worse conditions for wind and solar, right? So yeah, ultimately EPA in its cost analysis, we argued, left a lot of the cost off the table, or they at least didn't consider that. And then there's the social cost of blackouts, right? So people die during blackouts, businesses can't operate, so there's a cost to that too. And we found that if you look at that 2019 weather year, the cost of the blackouts, or the social cost of the blackouts, would be $56.7 billion based on this metric called the value of lost load. Just think of it as the cost of not having electricity for an economy.
Well, it's immense.
Right?
Well, for one thing, people die, Isaac.
Yep.
I mean, if there's no electricity in the winter in a state like Minnesota, people are going to die. This EPA regulation, if it goes through and gets implemented, is going to kill people. But let's talk about one more element, Isaac, that we haven't put into the equation yet, and that is what the EPA is assuming about demand for electricity, right? Because there's multiple things going on here. One of them is the EPA is trying to kill off coal-fired plants and limit the use of natural gas plants, which are the main reliable sources of electricity. But they're also, at the same time, trying to electrify everything. And so we're seeing federal regulatory efforts, as well as in some states, regulatory efforts to make us buy electric vehicles, whether we want them or not. And now the government's trying to take away our gas stoves and force us to use electric stoves. We had a proposal, I can't remember if it went through in this year's Minnesota legislature, to ban gasoline-powered lawnmowers and leaf blowers. They try to electrify everything. Well, obviously, if they do that, it's going to vastly increase the demand for electricity. Have they taken what did they assume about that whole piece of the equation?
Yeah, EPA was criticized for this because they didn't take into account those regulations that would essentially require a lot more of the vehicle fleet to be electric by 2030. I forget the specific numbers on that, but there was a lot of questions about, okay, well, EPA hasn't modeled how much electricity it's going to cost to make all the green hydrogen that they assume is going to be necessary for the grid. So between that and the electric vehicles, and California is going to be banning the sale of new internal combustion engines by 2035. Other states are also adopting that. Minnesota hasn't committed to that yet, but they have made it abundantly clear that they have the authority to do that if they want to. It's just a question of whether they think the public will tolerate that sort of executive action from the governor's office.
But in any event, this whole area of simultaneously trying to massively increase the demand for electricity isn't even taken into account. Sort of the left hand and the right hand, right? And so if they succeed in forcing us to electrify more elements of our economy, that's going to make the blackout situation even worse.
Yeah. Yep. It'll increase demand at a time when you have, less confidence in your supply.
Last question, Isaac. Where does it go from here? So this is the process that we have under the Administrative Procedure Act. The public has been filing comments. The grid operators have been running up the red warning flag. You guys have done your comment. Where does it go from here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So people are thinking that EPA is going to try and finalize this rule in the spring of 2024, although, you could see lawsuits that, essentially it goes to the courts now. Some people are probably going to try and get an injunction on it, saying that this is going to cause harm to people, irreparable harm, that, we need to be smart and have foresight here about what the consequences of this rule are. Because, in our modeling, we just assumed that EPA was right about what the grid was going to look like moving forward. But even these rules in their proposed form will have an influence on the investment decisions that utility companies are making, on whether it makes sense to put scrubbers for other pollutants on their coal plants, or whether it just makes more sense to retire them because, okay, well, we're going to have to shut this coal plant down anyway because we don't have a viable option for carbon capture and sequestration, maybe like the local geology, or they don't think they can get a CO2 pipeline. So there is going to be other people, other stakeholders in this who are going to say, look, we need to try and get some sort of stay at the judicial level. And I'm not a lawyer. You would know more about that aspect of it than I would. But so I would think that the courts are probably going to be the next big venue for this.
So if that litigation takes place, I expect that your report is going to be front and center as part of the rationale for getting courts to enjoin the implementation of this new regulation.
Yes, I think people will be very interested in what we found.
Well, Isaac, a fantastic work. You're really sticking up for the American people there, and we'll see how this plays out. We'll continue to cover it at AmericanExperiment.org.
Absolutely. Check it out on our website. The comments are there. I wrote like kind of a summary of the comments as well, more for the layperson, so you can understand what it is, why we did it. This is kind of a, like I said, it's kind of a wonky, in the weeds type of thing, but it is important. Kind of unfortunate that you have to, Congress is the government body that should be making rules.
Sure, but Congress wouldn't pass this.
Right, exactly. So unfortunately, we're in this situation where the administrative state has taken a bunch of liberties, and we're using the tools at our disposal to push back against that.
Great. Thank you, Isaac.
Yeah, thanks for having me.